What if his silence isn't rejection, but a test of your self-worth? And what if every time you chase after an answer, a text, or a piece of his attention, you're not responding to love, but to a subconscious game? Silence in a relationship can feel like abandonment wrapped in ambiguity. It can pierce more deeply than words, because it leaves you alone with your imagination, with no closure, no clear wound to clean. And so, you begin to bleed internally, in the dark. You ask yourself, did I say too much? Did I expect too much? Did I push him away? For many women, especially those shaped by years of caretaking, emotional labor, or neglect, his silence doesn't feel like just silence. It feels like failure. It feels like being erased. But before we rush to fill that void with explanations or justifications, we must pause. There is a truth beneath the surface. Some men use silence not only as a defense, but as a strategy, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. A strategy to test not whether you love him, but whether you love yourself enough not to beg. This chapter is not about condemning men or vilifying silence. It's about decoding it, especially when silence becomes a pattern, a form of communication that doesn't speak but commands, a withdrawal that forces you to act, and in acting, perhaps abandon yourself. Silence, from a psychological standpoint, is not always passive. Sigmund Freud taught us that what is not expressed is not lost. It is repressed, and repression has its own language. Often silence is that language. When words are too risky, when vulnerability feels too exposing, when confrontation threatens control, people choose silence, not because they have nothing to say, but because they fear what will happen if they say it. And here is the twist. The more emotionally attuned and empathetic a woman is, the more likely she is to chase that silence. Not because she is weak, but because she is wired to seek repair. She senses rupture and instinctively wants to reconnect. But in doing so, she may enter a dangerous loop, mistaking his absence for her responsibility. Silence can also be a behavioral test, an unconscious experiment. If I pull away, will she come closer? If I withhold, will she offer more? Skinner, the father of behaviorism, called this intermittent reinforcement. When rewards are given unpredictably, they create stronger, more addictive responses. This is how casinos operate. This is how emotional dependence grows. Silence, broken occasionally by affection or attention, keeps you spinning in hope. And here's the trap. When silence becomes a pattern, and you keep reacting to it, you train yourself to equate distance with desire. You begin to chase not the man, but the illusion of closeness that never fully arrives. So Freud would ask us, what is this silence really awakening in you? Is it just about this man, or is it touching an older wound? Perhaps the unspoken disappointment of a parent who was physically present, but emotionally unreachable. Or the cold withdrawal of someone who once made you feel invisible when you expressed a need. This is where transference enters the room, the unconscious projection of past relationships onto present ones. You may think you're responding to his silence, but your body may be remembering every time your love had to work harder, just to be seen. And when we are unaware of this dynamic, we perform. We become the good woman, the patient partner, the understanding one, hoping that if we prove our worth, the silence will end. But silence is not always a test you're meant to pass. Sometimes it's a lesson you're meant to leave. What if, instead of filling in the silence, you let it speak for itself? What if the true test is not whether you can survive his withdrawal, but whether you can refuse to lose yourself in it? There's power in not responding, not as punishment, but as preservation. Your silence, when chosen with intention, is not emptiness. It's a boundary, and sometimes it's the only way your nervous system can remember that it doesn't have to earn love. Let this be your first reflection. What am I trying to prove when I chase the silence of another? Write it down, let it simmer. We'll return to it, because silence is also a mirror, and what you see in it can either be your desperation or your dignity. To understand the silence of another is not to decode a puzzle. It is to face the parts of ourselves that still seek meaning in someone else's absence. Freud believed that human behavior, especially within intimate relationships, is not governed by logic, but by layers of unconscious impulses. What you interpret as indifference may, in fact, be a symptom of repression. And what you feel as abandonment may be the echo of an old internal conflict, one you didn't create, but one that now governs your reactions. When a man withdraws into silence, it is tempting to see it as a simple emotional shutdown, but it can often be something more complex, a defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms are psychological strategies developed by the unconscious mind to protect the individual from painful thoughts, feelings, or memories. They're not malicious. They are adaptive responses to emotional threats, and silence is one of the most subtle yet powerful among them. Silence can act as a shield. For some men, especially those unaccustomed to emotional vulnerability, silence becomes their safe space, a way to control the narrative by refusing to participate in it. Freud would suggest that beneath this silence often lies a conflict between the id, impulses, the ego, reality, and the superego, internalized societal expectations. A man who longs for closeness may simultaneously fear it. He wants connection but dreads the emotional exposure it requires. So he retreats, not because you're too much, but because intimacy feels like a battlefield he was never trained to survive. And here's where the dynamic becomes dangerous for women. You may interpret his silence as something personal, a reflection of your inadequacy or your emotional intensity. But in reality, his silence may have little to do with you. It may be an inherited language, passed down by fathers who never modeled emotional transparency, or by a culture that equates emotional expression with weakness. This is the terrain of projection. When we're unsure how to process our own inner world, we begin projecting it onto others. So you may find yourself thinking, he's punishing me, he doesn't care, I must have done something wrong. But that's not fact. It's fear, shaped by past experience. And then comes transference, a Freudian concept that explains why we often relive emotional patterns in new relationships. That feeling of devastation you experience when he doesn't reply. It may not be entirely about him. It may be your nervous system reliving the unspoken void left by someone from long ago. A parent, a caretaker, a lover who taught you that silence means danger. What Freud brings into sharp relief is this: relationships are never just about the present. They're haunted by what came before. If you grew up having to work for attention, to earn love by suppressing your needs, silence will feel intolerable. It will feel like rejection, even if it's not. Because the child inside you remembers. Silence meant disconnection, and disconnection meant you had to work harder to be loved. Now consider the superego, the internalized critic, shaped by cultural norms, childhood conditioning, and moral expectations. The superego may whisper to you, be understanding, don't be needy, don't push him away, give him space. And while there is wisdom in emotional regulation, there is also danger in silencing your own needs to keep the peace. The superego, unchecked, can guilt you into self-erasure. So Freud's question would not be, why is he silent? It would be, what does his silence awaken in you? And what part of your past is being reenacted through your response? When we understand that silence is more than just the absence of words, that it is a behavior shaped by fear, repression, and learned patterns, we can stop trying to decode him and start decoding ourselves. It is not your job to interpret another's emotional silence at the expense of your own clarity. It is not your role to soothe the discomfort of a man who has not learned how to stay present with his own vulnerability. And it is not your destiny to become the translator of someone else's emotional immaturity. Here is your reflection for this chapter. Who was the first person who taught me that silence meant I wasn't enough? Sit with that. Let your nervous system trace it not to him, but to the place it really began. That is where the healing lives. What if the silence isn't neglect, but calculation? Not always consciously, but deeply rooted in behavior, power, and emotional strategy. Some men, often without malice, test through absence, not through dialogue, but through disappearance. They create a space and wait to see what you will do with it. Will you panic? Will you over-explain? Will you chase? In the subtle realm of human behavior, silence can be a stimulus, and your response becomes the data. Skinner would recognize this immediately. In every action, a consequence, and from every consequence, a pattern is born. Some men, particularly those with ambivalent attachment or a desire to maintain emotional control, use silence as a way to measure. It's not a request for space. It's a mirror, tilted just enough to see how much of yourself you're willing to give up to feel chosen again. This isn't always cruel. Sometimes it's deeply unconscious. A man uncertain of his emotions might retreat not because he doesn't care, but because closeness makes him feel emotionally naked. His silence is not a weapon, it's armor. But if you've been conditioned to associate silence with threat, you'll interpret it as rejection and react from that place. This is where power dynamics come in. Silence reconfigures the emotional balance. The one who waits often feels smaller, less certain. The one who withholds feels, even momentarily, in control. And if you move quickly to repair, reassure, or resume the connection, you may unintentionally reinforce the very behavior that hurt you. Inconsistent silence, broken by sudden warmth, is especially potent. It triggers emotional confusion, and emotional confusion creates dependency. You wait not for love, but for relief. This is not connection, it's conditioning. But let's pause. Not all silence is manipulation. Some is simply difference. There are those who communicate by withdrawing, who process emotion through solitude, who find talking exhausting. The danger lies not in difference, but in disconnection, in the refusal to meet halfway, in the pattern where your needs are always negotiable and his space is sacred. So how do you decode his silence? Ask, is he silent to avoid intimacy and or to process it? Does he come back with clarity, or return only when he senses you're slipping away? Does his silence invite growth, or keep you walking on eggshells? Because a test that requires you to lose yourself is not a test worth passing. Here is your reflection. Do I respond to silence out of clarity, or out of fear that love will leave me again? That answer holds the key to your emotional power. There's a moment, quiet, often invisible, when a woman abandons herself. Not in one grand gesture, but in small, repeated surrenders. She texts first, apologizes first, bends first, explains herself when she wasn't even asked. And the worst part? She calls this love. But it's not love. It's survival dressed in longing. When a man withdraws, and your first instinct is to go after him, to fix, soothe, prove, what you're chasing isn't just him. You're chasing your own worth, as if his silence gets to decide whether you're enough. This is the psychological loop of self-abandonment. You begin with the impulse to restore connection, but in doing so, you override your own need for reciprocity, for dignity. Each time you reach for someone who won't reach back, a piece of you becomes quieter, less heard, less held, even by yourself. Freud understood this repetition, the compulsion to reenact unresolved emotional scripts. If love once meant striving, you will recreate that pattern until you realize this striving has nothing to do with the man in front of you. It is your nervous system trying to resolve a past it never got to complete. Attachment theory deepens this understanding. Women with anxious attachment, often shaped by inconsistent caregivers, may equate withdrawal with danger. The silence isn't just uncomfortable, it feels catastrophic. So you chase not because you're irrational, but because your body believes love is leaving, and survival depends on retrieving it. But what is the cost? Each unanswered message chips away at your self-trust. Each moment you silence your instincts to preserve the relationship teaches your brain that your needs don't matter. Boundaries blur, and you find yourself making excuses for someone who only shows up when it's convenient. This is how negative reinforcement traps you. You experience anxiety from the silence. You reach out. He responds, maybe sweetly, maybe just enough. Your anxiety drops. Relief floods your system. And just like that, your brain learns. Chasing works. Even if it only buys you temporary connection, the cycle continues. Over time, this becomes addiction, to his validation, to the temporary highs that keep you bound to emotional lows. Freud would urge you to look not at what you do, but why you must do it. Why must you chase someone who is not reaching for you? Why must you prove your love to someone who is silent? Love does not live in pursuit. It lives in presence, and no woman was born to earn her way into being heard. So here is your reflection. What parts of myself do I abandon when I chase someone who chooses silence over communication? Write them down. Give them voice. Those parts have been waiting for you to come back. What if silence isn't a punishment, but an invitation? Not to chase, but to return. Not to him, but to yourself. There is a moment when the silence of another becomes unbearable, not because of what it says, but because of what it reflects. Your own forgotten voice. The space he leaves behind is not just empty, it's echoing. And in that echo, your truest self might be calling you home. For so many women, silence has been associated with danger. It meant neglect. It meant distance. It meant having to try harder, talk softer, apologize for existing too much. So when a man falls silent, the fear is not just emotional, it's physiological. Your nervous system remembers, and in an effort to not be left again, you rush to fix what was never yours to hold. But what if you chose not to fill the silence? What if you met it with your own? This is the beginning of transformation, when you stop fearing silence and begin using it, not as a weapon, but as a sanctuary. Silence, when claimed, becomes clarity. It creates space between the stimulus and your reaction. It slows the cycle of reactivity. It becomes the room where your intuition, long overshadowed by emotional noise, can finally speak. Freud taught us that behavior is never random. It's reinforced, it's learned. And if you've been conditioned to respond to silence by overperforming, then choosing to not react is already an act of rebellion, a rewiring, a breaking of the loop. Instead of texting, write in your journal. Instead of calling him, call yourself back into your own body. Instead of interpreting his withdrawal, inquire into your own needs. This is not passive, it is profoundly active. It is the beginning of emotional detachment, not coldness but clarity. Detachment says, I can care and still choose me. Boundaries are born in silence, not when you scream them, but when you embody them, when you no longer explain or beg, when your energy shifts from seeking to centering. And it is here, in the stillness, that independence becomes more than survival. It becomes joy. You begin to remember your wholeness, not because someone validated it, but because you stopped abandoning it. The truth is, the woman who can hold her silence is dangerous, not because she plays games, but because she no longer responds to them. She doesn't confuse absence with affection. She doesn't barter with her dignity for temporary closeness. She knows her peace is the highest form of power. So Freud would not simply tell you to stay silent. He would ask, can you tolerate the discomfort of not being chosen and still choose yourself anyway? Because once you can, you're free. Here is your practice. Write a letter to the version of you that used to beg for attention. Tell her what you now know. Tell her she can rest. There comes a day when you no longer need an answer from him, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've started listening to yourself. That is the moment silence transforms. It no longer signals abandonment. It becomes boundary. It no longer wounds. It teaches. You've walked through each stage, from confusion to pain to awareness. You've questioned your patterns, met your wounds, and chosen not to chase the absence of someone else at the cost of your own presence. And now you stand at the edge of something radical, self-respect. Because what you once feared, his silence, you now see clearly. It was never about your worth. It was a reflection of his behavior, his limitations, his unresolved conflicts, his fear of intimacy, his inability or unwillingness to meet you in the emotional space you so generously opened. You don't need to personalize what was never personal. You don't need to create meaning from someone else's emotional absence. You don't need to perform for love that arrives only when it wants to and leaves when it doesn't. In this silence, you've discovered your own voice, and it speaks of dignity, discernment, and peace. When you stop chasing, you start choosing. When you stop proving, you start preserving. When you stop reacting, you start remembering who you were before you thought love had to be earned. Freud might say, your unconscious drives no longer control you. You have made the invisible visible. You've brought light to the places where compulsion used to live. That is the beginning of freedom. And this is not bitterness. This is not closing your heart. Quite the opposite. It's protecting your heart with the reverence it deserves. It's saying, the silence I give myself is sacred. It's not empty. It's full of me. So now you move forward, not waiting for the next message or the next wave of affection after days of drought. You move forward knowing that real love doesn't test through withdrawal. It shows up, it speaks, it listens, and it never asks you to betray yourself in order to stay connected. What you tolerate teaches others how to treat you, and you, now, tolerate only truth, presence, reciprocity. Let the silence you once feared become your most trusted guide, because in it you heard something louder than any apology he never gave, your own decision to stop waiting. This is where your story begins again. If you've ever navigated silence in a relationship and found your way back to yourself, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Your voice may be the mirror another woman needs to hear her own truth. And if this spoke to you, subscribe. We're building something here, not noise, not fantasy, but grounded psychological clarity and the kind of emotional freedom that can't be taken, only claimed.